The inspiration for The Greatest Generation actually happened here in Normandy about 20 years ago for you.
It did. The 40th anniversary of D-Day, I began to walk the beaches with members of the Big Red One who survived that day. One went on to earn the Congressional Medal of Honor. The other one lost both legs later in the war. They were so humble, and they were so concerned about their friends who didn't make it back. And they'd led such honorable lives once they returned to America. One a school teacher, one working for the VA, talking about patriotism and American values. And that was the beginning, really, of me thinking about how much we owed that generation. I went from here to a little cafe in town, ran into a Florida congressman by the name of Sam Gibbons who had jumped in that day. As he told his story, tears began to run down his cheek. He was a tough guy, I knew that. And it was an absolutely riveting tale. So for the next 10 to 12 years, I began collecting these stories and then wrote The Greatest Generation.
Your own family is also inspiration for this story as well.
Well, my own family is in a way, but because we lived in an army base and they made their contributions, and my first memories of life really are of the war. I was born in 1940, and I remember the talk about war. We were living, first my dad was building an air base in Minnesota, and we had blackouts when I was like 2 years old. It was very dramatic. Then we moved to an army base. He was drafted. They sent him back because he made the base run. And everybody around me was in uniform and going to war, coming home from war, or doing something for the war. I wore a helmet like most kids wear baseball caps now, because those were my heroes when I was 4 and 5 years old. And then suddenly the war was over and we went on to that newfound American working class prosperity, and I kind of put it in the back of my mind. And then I realized most of my coaches, the people I worked for, mothers and fathers of my friends were all World War II veterans.
In your research, what have you found, and what's the reason why these veterans have been so humble about their great sacrifice?
Well, I think two things. One is that they had difficult lives before the war. They grew up in the Great Depression, and that really hammered this country in so many ways. They had to do without. They had to quit school to go to work, to put food on the table. They shared clothing and beds and housing. A lot of veterans said to me they never had a great breakfast until they joined the Army. They couldn't believe when they got to basic training how much they could eat. Some said, I never had a new pair of boots until I got in the Army. And then they went through the war, and they saw all that was sacrificed around them, their best friends who didn't make it back. They survived in most cases because it was random. They were just lucky. And so when they came home from all of that experience of the Depression and the war, they were determined to put it behind them and get on with life and to work for their families and their communities and for their country.
You also get a chance to talk to current soldiers, and what are some of the things you discuss with the current soldiers?
Well, I'm struck by, the volunteer army is a great thing in many ways because they're highly motivated, highly trained, well-educated. The current armed forces, these guys from The Greatest Generation, are in awe of all that they can do. But we lose something as well because there's a disconnect between the armed forces and the rest of the country. If you don't have somebody in your family immediately involved or who may be involved in some fashion, there's a tendency to kind of put it off to the side in some ways. And I think that that's where we've missed some opportunities in this country.
What lessons do you think current soldiers can learn from The Greatest Generation?
Well, I suppose the greatest lesson is look out for each other. And every soldier or Marine or airman or sailor I've ever met says, really, when it comes down to it, that's what you're doing. You're looking out for your buddies, men or women in this case now. And then remember that what you're doing is a great, great service. I have a young friend who's over there now. He's a highly trained doctor. He owed the Army a commitment because they paid for his medical school. If he were back in civilian clothing, he'd be making a ton of money as a cancer surgeon. But he has this obligation, and I say to him, 20 years from now, Pete, you'll look back on this and realize how great it was that you were able to do what you were able to do, put bodies back together again, help Iraqi civilians, serve your country. That's an honor.
What's the most rewarding part about being here for the 60th for you?
Oh, it's all rewarding. It's a reminder to me in so many ways of how lucky I have been. I grew up in the shadow of these people, although I didn't realize it at the time because they didn't want to overshadow me. What they were trying to do was push me out in the sunlight constantly. Make life better for me. Give me another chance. Cheer me on when something happened to me. one of the guys that I knew in my hometown was a sports writer, for example. I was an okay athlete, not a great athlete. But I was a varsity letterman, and he would write nice things about it. But he would always include when I did something outside of athletics. You know, I was elected governor of Boise State, or when I got the job that I have now, or when I had some other success. He'd write these wonderful columns. Well, it turns out he did all the photo recon on Omaha Beach and almost got shot down twice by the Luftwaffe. I didn't know that the whole time I was growing up. My high school football coach had a big impact on me. Veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. I didn't know that until he died, because they all kept us quiet. And they were all out there saying to us, hey, we're here to help you. And so I think that's what means so much to me. And this is my small way of paying those people back.
You've done a lot to help preserve the history of the Greatest Generation in writing the books and bringing the documentaries that you've done. When you step down from the anchor chair later on this year, will you continue to help preserve that history with these veterans?
Oh, sure. This is a fixed part of my life. I'm probably not going to write another book about World War II. I've written 3 of them now. But I'm always amazed every time when I think I've heard all the stories, I hear 4 or 5 more good ones. Just on this trip, I've been here twice this spring to Normandy. And I've heard 3 astonishing stories that I didn't know about before. One will become an hour documentary. One involves a young girl who was killed in ceremonies in Carentan when she was giving flowers to the 101st Airborne, and they got shelled from some distance away. And the 101st kind of took her in. So that was another story that I heard. And then I've heard other stories just on the beach here that I hadn't heard before. And I'll continue to make sure that they see the light of day and they get the kind of attention they deserve.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Brokaw.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it. And before I go, I don't know, this is a military tradition. I'm sure you've probably had this happen to you before. But I'll give you the AFM coin.
Now you're from. If I don't have this in Syracuse, I gotta buy you beers. Is that the deal?
No, in Frankfurt. If you're in Frankfurt, you don't have that.
Okay.
I appreciate
if I carried all those coins, I must have. I don't know how many of them. About 100 at this point.